Hi, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you're all well and enjoying the podcast. As always, I welcome any thoughts, suggestions, and feedback you have to make the podcast better, and of course, any suggestions you have for guests you'd like to see. I wanted to share with you a new way to participate in the Whiskey Ring Podcast Bottle Share Club. There are several people who have reached out to me about being put on a waiting list for the top tier. After much thought, I've decided to open that tier up to more people. If you have been hesitating, or if you are a current supporter wanting to level up, reach out to me at david@whiskeyinmyweddingring.com or through social media or Patreon, and I'll be happy to help you move up. I also wanted to send a special thanks to my current $25 a month patrons, who have agreed not only to this change, but who have been truly irreplaceable supporters of this and who make this podcast happen. Thank you to all of you in no particular order. I'm talking to you, Ken, Jesse, Jim, and Bill, Don, and John, Yana, Connor, Zach, Scott, Ollie, Steve, and Jake. Without your support, this podcast wouldn't be happening anymore. And thank you for helping me to keep the lights on and keep guests coming to you every week. As always, you could support the podcast for as little as $1 a month, with ad-free episodes starting at $5 a month. This support is the reason the lights stay on, and to make sure the podcast and website are the best they can be. Thank you to all who are already patrons, and I hope to have more listeners join soon. Visit patreon.com/whiskeyinmyweddingring to join today. Without further ado, here's a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Hey listeners, just wanted to issue a quick correction here before we go forward. So back in the Copperworks episode with Jason Parker, a fantastic episode back on number 134 a few weeks ago, I mistakenly said that one of the products was a Copperworks whiskey finished in a slow gin cask. And I had said that it was from Lost Lantern Whiskey. The product that I was thinking of was from Lost Lantern, but it was not from Copperworks. It was from Spiritworks in California. So it was a 2022 single cask from Lost Lantern. It was a Spiritworks California Straight Rye Whiskey finished in a slow gin cask that I had the pleasure of reviewing for the whiskeyinmyweddingring.com website. So definitely take a look at that review. I don't think there are any bottles left of that particular release, but I know that there might be some in the future, and certainly Spiritworks is a distillery that we will be looking at in the future. Thank you again, and apologies again to Lost Lantern and Copperworks for the mix-up, and thank you all for listening, and if anything else comes up, please feel free to give me a shout-out, and happy to make a correction wherever needed. All that said, please enjoy the episode. Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today we are going back over the Atlantic to Ireland. And I will say just barely, because we are going to the westernmost area of Europe, I should say. We're going into the Dingle Peninsula. And today, to talk with us about Dingle Distillery is Elliot Hughes. I should have asked for your title before, and I didn't. That's completely on me.
That's all right. Managing director.
Managing director. Thank you. The last interview I listened to was with Graham Cooley, your master distiller. And I was like, I know he's not the master distiller. Like, get it together. Get it together, right, David. Okay. Anyway. So Elliot, welcome on. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Dingle. I've got a bunch of questions for you. We're also going to taste through hopefully all four if we get to all four. If not, well, there will certainly be notes and such about it. Got 4 expressions of Dingle as well. The core single malt, as well as 3 of the Celtic Wheel of the Year releases that have come out, which I'm very excited to talk about. So let's get started. So the first question, I'd just love to set the stage. So Dingle, for anyone who may not have heard of Dingle or is not that into Irish whiskey or hasn't heard about Irish whiskey, the first craft distillery in Ireland certainly in this century and for much longer than that, really. To set the stage, I just wanted to dive a little bit into the Irish whiskey history. So just to give our listeners a little bit of background, how did we go from hundreds of distilleries when guys like Alfred Barnard were going around the island down to a few dozen, and then eventually in the 70s and 80s down to really just 3, Midleton, Bushmills, and Cooley?
Yeah, well, look, I suppose it's there's probably many reasons, but I suppose the reasons that are kind of frequently cited, prohibition being being an obvious one that I suppose prohibition caused issues with whiskey coming into the United States in terms of moonshine, as a product that realistically was being passed off as Irish, pretty poor quality, people's reputation, people's thought process in Irish whiskey kind of reduced further and further. And that became problematic for the reputation of Irish whiskey. The other thing that's I suppose always tend to be pointed at is the coffee still. It's not necessarily I suppose a secret that it was something that was presented to various different Irish distilleries as a way of making more efficiencies within Irish within whiskey full stop. And it was, I suppose, maybe frowned upon and not looked as the way forward for the way Irish whiskey wanted to see itself. I suppose that then made its way over to Scotland, where it certainly wasn't frowned upon, and it was taken up with gusto, and it allowed them to produce it at a much more efficient rate, providing better pricing across the board. So I think there was kind of a combination. Those two are the ones most frequently cited, but I'm sure that's kind of like everything, there's probably a multitude of 10, 15, 20 different reasons, including, I'm sure, a lack of variety, a lack of quality across the board, a lack of imagination, I would imagine at times. But I'm sure it's always easy to point the finger at the one or two big things, especially something like prohibition, where it wasn't our fault that that's what happened. So, we're entirely blameless in this process, which is a nice story to tell, but I'm sure if if you could go back in time, probably isn't entirely accurate.
Fair enough, fair enough. And I imagine too, I mean, I've been thinking about what made Ireland more, let's say, more susceptible to this consolidation. And in reading a book recently, I can't see the author's name. It was a big book of 2023. It was We Don't Know Ourselves. It was a history of personal history of Ireland, and the Ireland as a country has traditionally been kind of underserved, if not outright put upon by the uh, the overall UK. And it seems like whereas Scotch, as you said, the Scottish distillers were able to survive in a greater number and a greater quantity, Irish distillers did not have that same opportunity. And I always look at, is that also another reason why consolidation happened? You go down to these really one massive distillery in Midleton, and then a very large one in Bushmills, and a slightly smaller but still quite large one at Cooley as well. Um, but but that's another history for another day. So fast forwarding to the early 2000s, your father, Oliver Hughes, who has since unfortunately passed in 2016, but he and a couple of friends had this idea for a new distillery in Ireland. So let's start off with why in Dingle.
Um, yeah, I suppose there's so why in Dingle, I suppose to give you even probably move back a couple of steps. I suppose my father Oliver and his business partner since the mid to late 80s, Liam would have a business partner and cousin, um, always were fascinated by the drink sector. Originally beer, the guys started and failed fast in a business in 1983 where they opened up a small brewery just south of Dublin. They're producing real ale at the time. Struggled, the beer was allegedly good. I never got a chance to taste it, but by all accounts, certainly by their accounts, it was good. And they struggled to maybe maintain a good debt collection aspect to the business, and ran out of money fairly quickly. But that was kind of the start of it. I suppose they then went into the hospitality side, opening a pub, again, kind of just south of Dublin in 1989. But I suppose the passion was always in terms of, pubs in Ireland were and still are, to be perfectly frank, quite similar, in terms of drinks offering. I suppose people listening in the US and in the UK as well, would probably turn up to an Irish pub, and you get all of the things that you expect in terms of the friendliness and the crack and the fun. But the one thing you don't get is a good drink selection. You might get a really good pint of Guinness, but you're not usually able to get maybe a local brewery craft beers, or sometimes distillery offerings as well. So Oliver and Liam were really passionate about doing something a bit different. So they opened what was Dublin's first kind of brew pub. I suppose it's called microbrewery at the time, so the term tended to change towards craft over the years. But they opened that in 1996 within a new pub that they opened within in Temple Bar, which lots of people are aware of, kind of a busy, kind of popular spot in Dublin. It wasn't necessarily that at the time, but yeah, so that started. We were the first pub in the country not to be serving Guinness. We didn't serve Budweiser or Heineken, any kind of macro beers, and everything we produced, everything we sold initially at the start, we produced ourselves, but then we started to branch out into taking on some good craft offerings from other Irish breweries, European and American breweries as well. So it was always kind of drinks related. The guys went on to open a few more bars within Ireland, the UK, and a couple in New York as well. So there's always that kind of passion. We joked that it was, when they were in college, and the idea of becoming brewers was really what they wanted to do, and it was all about beer. As they got older and maybe a little bit wiser, the things moved towards whiskey, and their taste palates changed a little bit. So, look, and as you know, and I'm sure people listen to this know, the world of beer and the world of whiskey aren't miles apart. So, we felt that it was certainly the guys would have felt at the time that it wasn't a huge leap. Um, I suppose the question originally you asked was why Dingle. So Dingle is a town of about 2,500 people, on the west coast of the Atlantic. Is the most westerly point in Europe. It's um, it's a pretty fantastic place in the sense of it's a mix of this amazing scenery, coastal scenery, that if you think about anything, you think about the west of Ireland, seen any kind of films, whatever it might be, Banshees of Inisherin, or any kind of those kind of films, it is exactly what you think. It's that kind of wild, rugged coastal landscape. But also, I suppose, in comparison to, there's no other place in Ireland like it. It mixes that with this fantastic town, which is, it's, say, 2,500 people, but there's, 25, 30 pubs, 15 restaurants. It's I said per capita, probably I would imagine the most pubs per person per resident. And they're all, really great, proper Irish bars, or Irish pubs, very cozy, very atmospheric, very welcoming, very warm. And Dingle as a town itself is incredibly food, drink orientated, and very art orientated. There's, enormous amount of galleries around the town. There's, enormous amount of people that are, there's different festivals, music festivals, literary festivals, film festivals. So it's a place for creativity. And I suppose what happened was we've been going there on holidays since certainly I remember, and my parents would have been going there on holidays prior to getting married, prior to having myself and my sister. So it's been a place that we would have traveled to for a very long period of time. Um, I say Dingle is incredibly difficult to get to. It certainly was more difficult than it is now. We're from Dublin and based in Dublin, and I know, this probably for Irish people it's ridiculous. For American people, there's much more understanding that driving big lengths is acceptable in America. It's not in Ireland. So, back when we were going originally, it was kind of 6, 7 hours. It's probably about 5 hours, but for Irish people, that is the longest period you'd ever be in the car ever. So it's a tough place to get to, but it's worth it when you get there. And that's where we would have gone for years. So I suppose at a certain stage, Oliver would have been very much the ideas guy within the business, and really wanted to build this distillery. And our brewery in Dublin, which had since moved from a pub, was in an industrial estate just outside of Dublin. I think the feeling was that a distillery needed more romanticism, and a little bit more to it than that. So um Dingle was put forward as the place. I think probably the biggest battle across anything was my father convincing my mother that he could have a place of business in, in the same place we would visit kind of a couple of times a year on holidays. So that was probably the biggest challenge he'd faced at the time. But yeah, that was really it. It was kind of a place that um Oliver had fallen in love with, and every time he brought different business partners and that they became involved in the process, they fell in love with it. It's also a place that, has such name recognition that I say for a town of just over 2,500 people, the name recognition is unbelievable. I can't imagine there's anywhere else like it. That there's people, particularly, well, obviously in the Irish context of things, but along the eastern coast of the US, a lot of places in kind of central Western Europe, where people have either traveled, they know people. It's a place that a lot of people tend to know. So it was a combination of all those factors, and probably an element of also it was just a really cool place to have a distillery, I think.
And I mean, when you look at the site, both the website but also the site online, you see the videos. There's also a link on the website to the Wild Atlantic Way, of which uh, Dingle Peninsula is part. And I remember I was listening to, I think, Stories and Sips with Barry Chandler, and Mary Ferreter, the general manager, was on and just talking about this Wild Atlantic Way. And when you look at it, it just looks like nowhere else on Earth. The different coastlines, and it goes from all the way up from Donegal in the far north, all the way down to far south, with the end of the Gulf Stream, the break in the Atlantic. So there's quite a lot of sense of place there and terroir coming. And I'll have a more direct question about that in a little bit too. One I wanted to pull out, though, is, as you said, you're and your family are originally from Dublin, and in Dingle's a Gaeltacht region. And of course, if I say anything in Gaelic and my uh, pronunciations are off, please feel free to correct me. Uh,
Yeah, mine won't be much better, but
uh, so with Dingle being a Gaeltacht region, so somewhere where the Irish language is still very much taught and spoken. In some ways, I think of it as this a heritage area, just like parts of Donegal, and there are a couple of different areas in Ireland like that. When deciding to move there, was there a thought of, not only everything you've just described about this is a beautiful place, it's a destination, but also this idea that if we're going to build a distillery, that's probably going to be the first new distillery in 100 years there, uh, that you wanted to do it in a place that was so close to that heritage Irish spirit.
yeah, I think there's definitely elements of that. I won't currently pretend that that was kind of the driving factor of it. My father would have been a guy where it was all about the vision of the I suppose the sentimentality of it, the romanticism of it, and that would have been, I suppose, for him anyway, that would have been kind of the key core driver of that. Because I mean, and again, it's probably, the Wild Atlantic Way as an area, as a place, has existed for obviously thousands and thousands of years or millions of years, whatever it might be. But as a concept, the Wild Atlantic Way is only about a decade old. And it's actually an interesting. It's probably one of the best pieces of tourism board advertising that I've ever seen. It's actually pretty incredible how it's been adopted, and by not just I suppose tourists coming in, but by the locality, because it has worked phenomenally well in trying to bring all that together. But it's a place that you know look, as I said, I'm a few hours away, but you're a world apart. I mean, I remember we had just gone back a few years. We had people coming over from London, and you can fly from London to about an hour and a half away, an hour away from Dingle, and like these guys who are working in the middle of the city of London get on a flight, and then within 3 or 4 hours, they're walking around with the with the sheep on the cliffs in Dingle is you know is that kind of special aspect which I think really spoke to the guys when they were looking at what they wanted to do. They wanted to kind of, I suppose, create this story in people's heads. And to be perfectly honest, if you're there, it's not very difficult to paint that story. It's sometimes with words things can be difficult. We obviously use all our photography and video, but what we love to do is get people to Dingle, because as soon as they get there, they realize what we've been talking about, and I suppose how much of an impact that, I suppose, the town and not so like, gee, I wouldn't be I suppose I wouldn't want to rewrite history and say that we've planned all of this, but the town itself has had a massive impact on how the distilleries operated. If the distillery had operated in or it started in its exact same guys in another town, it would be a completely different business. It'd be a completely different brand building. Everything about it would be different. The town itself has molded what we do, whether it's the people who are living there, whether it's kind of the people who visit us. It's a completely different business than was ever envisaged kind of 15 years ago when the project was first thought of. We would always be guilty of not really thinking too long term. I hope we're a little bit better than at the time. It was right. Let's get this up and running, and then we figure out what we do. And as I said, the town has massively molded everything that we do in relation to it, and absolutely for the better. And it's given its a character to the brand and to the business that I don't think we really envisaged. I know we didn't really envisage all those years ago.
I know you kind of came into Dingle more fully a couple years after this would have taken place, but I'm curious to ask what I can about the that startup process. So
Hmm.
once Oliver's cousin and third business partner come in and say, "All right, this is where we want to build our distillery. We know it's the first one in County Kerry, I think in 175 years or something, ridiculous number in the history of whiskey." Um, you talk about the town being so important here, and in going back to the startup phase, was there much pushback from the town, or was it more just surprise that someone wanted to build this kind of industry in the area?
No, well, again, as you mentioned, like I wasn't involved in the distillery for the first couple of years. I was still in school, to be perfectly honest with you. But from my memory and from conversations, there was no pushback. I suppose for the context, this would have been, we opened in winter 2012, but obviously the project had been going on for a couple of years before, and gossip as to what was going on in this building that hadn't been used for a couple of years. But it was 2011. Ireland was in the middle of a quite a crippling recession, and the recession that impacted massively more small towns across rural Ireland than it would have done in the cities. So anybody who was coming in that looked like they would be creating jobs was massively appreciated. So I think there was, the people in Dingle, and to this day it's the exact same. They understand the importance of businesses coming in, creating jobs, keeping young people in particular in Dingle, and not whether it's emigrating or moving to Cork or Limerick or Dublin or wherever it might be. And they value that over nearly everything else from a business point of view, from my experience anyway. And it's I think they knew that, potentially this had a chance of creating a few jobs, keeping it there. I think the really interesting point, and I don't really know enough about it, was the decision to name the brand Dingle and to kind of put the brand front and center. I think that's where, probably alluding to, that's where obviously you could create a lot of tension as to why these outsiders, because none of the three founders were, there was a guy from Dublin, a guy from Tipperary, and a guy from England. Um, None of the three founders were from Dingle. Yeah, there was obviously an element of we'd been holidaying there for a number of years, and Oliver would have been maybe a little bit well known, certainly in the pubs, if nowhere else. But yeah, I think they took it to their heart. I think the context of where the country was and where rural Ireland in particular was back then meant that anybody who was willing to try something a little bit different, do something that could improve the area, improve people's opportunities in an area was welcomed. And I think that's kind of really embracing as opposed to we always do say there's in Ireland anyway, very much a begrudging effect on anybody who does well. And it's, it's true when you talk about Bono or anybody like that. It's, these people are always seem to be very well liked outside of Ireland. And it's the same true with business in a lot of places. But we've never found that in Dingle. It's kind of been just, they understand the benefits. We don't pretend to get everything right all the time by any stretch, but they understand the benefits of what the distillery and other businesses like the distillery bring to the town far outweigh maybe the odd mistake we make in whatever we do.
It's a fair point. I mean, when is just as important as where in these origin stories. And it sounds like because Dingle was it's a smaller town, it's not necessarily industrial, it's highly dependent on tourism, that perhaps even when the area was not in a recession, that maybe it still would have been pretty receptive. But I think, as you said, that being the time period helped as well in terms of just getting the distillery off the ground, or on the ground, I guess is a better way to put it. And
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
no, no, good.
No, I was going to say, yeah, you're right. As much as I wasn't talking at the time, the fact is, and it probably is a big element of it, is that Dingle is a tourist-driven town and has been for, a long time previous to us being there. As I say, people there know where their bread is buttered. They know that tourism is an important part of the town. They don't take it for granted. They know they need to work on it. You can't just be a tourist town today and you're forever going to benefit from that because you say I suppose there's no real industry outside of, I suppose, fishing, farming and tourism within Dingle. And both fishing and farming have had a tough time over the last 15, 20 years, and tourism is the way that has brought more money into the town as of late. And I think they they know that, and they say it's not just us. There's a number of other businesses that are either maybe moved in or probably more likely have started by people locally, from breweries to retail units to ice cream manufacturers that have, you know, as I say they bring tourism in, they bring employment in, and the knowledge of that I always think is really impressive because I know lots of other places in Ireland where distilleries don't have nearly as much. I suppose they don't benefit from that open-mindedness as much as we might do.
Mhm. Absolutely fair. I know in just the couple of other Irish distillers that I've been fortunate to talk to, such as Maurice O'Connell over at Wayward, and James Doherty up at Sleeve League. The locals appreciate when you appreciate the locality. I'm sure that applies elsewhere too, but it seems notable in a place where this is an industry that was gone from most of the country for decades, if not a century, and then coming up. So, as we start talking about the first days of Dingle, shall we open up? Or I guess shall I open up the core single malt?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead. I won't stop you.
All right. So I open this. This is the Dingle Single Malt Triple Distilled Irish Whiskey, matured in sherry and bourbon casks, non-chill filtered. It's at 46.3% ABV. So even if you wanted to chill filter it, you don't have to. But thank you for not doing it anyway.
Yeah, it's this is I suppose, and I know the kind of the other three whiskeys are kind of our limited series side of things. I suppose prior to the whiskey you're drinking now, Dingle only released limited series whiskies as part of our batch release or pot still release series. Um, and that's just, I suppose, as a distillery, we release what we produce. We don't buy bulk in, which means that we're kind of stuck with whatever we produced. And the reality is in the early days, we were maybe not as efficient as we'd like to be. And I don't know, we might touch on the Founding Fathers program that kind of took up an awful lot of our casks as well for the first year or two. So everything was very small scale for the first few years. I think our first ever release was, I think it was like 3,000 bottles or something like that, and that was us for the year. And then we did something the following year. So it was all very small scale. And then we built it up as we went on until we got to this, which is our, I say, our first permanent release. We released that in May 2021 in Ireland. I think it only arrived into the US about a year and a half later. Um, but it's yeah, it's an interesting one because it's predominantly PX cast is 61% PX, 39% bourbon, all first fill barrels. So it's probably a little bit more than people might normally expect from maybe a core release product. I suppose we felt I suppose we wanted to bring the PX partly because it was probably the make of the cast we had at the time. But we felt the PX really added an awful lot to the whiskey. It is between 5 and 6 years. We thought the PX kind of helped that along a little bit more than if it was a bit more bourbon dominated.
I mean, I want to pull out a phrase you just used because it's really important. The core range, and I'm not sure who said it. It was on the Distilled podcast back in January of 2020, but it was either I think you or Graham, but you said the difference between a core release and a limited edition is how many people buy it.
Yeah, I can
And
vaguely remember that. Yeah.
and it's just
Uh,
it was just such a great quote because it's very true.
Yeah, well, I'd like to think we've designed this to be a core release, but yeah, certainly we still probably have a couple of core releases hanging around from from a few years ago. But it's yeah, we probably learned our lesson on a couple of things. But it was a funny one though because it was something I kind of resisted for probably a couple of years. We probably could have done this a year, if not 2 years previous, and I resisted a little bit because I didn't necessarily, and I probably wrongly didn't think that it was the way for Dingle to go. And I thought we could have, I knew we eventually wanted to go down that route, but I thought kind of the limited series kind of worked well for us at the time. And then also with I suppose, our cast makeup of kind of really what we had to try and get something that was actually consistent, that we weren't chopping and changing and changing it around after a year or 2 years, or that we could actually do a decent bit of volume in it as well. But I suppose, eventually convinced that we should do it over a lot of Zoom meetings. It must be said we kind of created that because we were all stuck inside. But yeah, we kind of decided to go down that route because we were getting an awful lot of people asking for something that I suppose one from a price point of view that was a bit more approachable for people. And two, something that was actually kind of the consistent Dingle product that we could kind of come out with on a regular basis. So we're quite proud of it. It's something that, it is as much as I say it's consistent, it does change. It does, we do try and improve the quality as we go with our cask getting a little bit older. It's not, this isn't Jameson. It's not the same product every single time, every time you pick it up. And look, there's a place for that, and there's a lot of positive things about that, but that's not who we are. And we to a certain degree, we use a Solera style system forward as well to try and create a little element of consistency. But we know that, I'm sure if you picked up that bottle or you picked up a bottle from a year previously, yeah, there's going to be an awful lot of similarities, an awful lot of things that we're trying to carry through, but there will be nuances that are different as well.
Also, going into that question, would you say that Dingle has a house style or house character that we should look for beyond the cask?
Um, I'd say it's more that I've been told by several people that we do. Um,
Hey,
I,
that's fair enough.
I can't find it. I find it challenging enough to be objective on on what we do, which is maybe not that unusual. But maybe I'll be a bit more honest in saying that I do find it challenging to be objective. Um, and also I'd say, there's a lot more people who know an awful lot more on whiskey than I do. But there's a lot of people outside of the business who, the more we released, the more people kind of felt that there was that kind of signature style that they'd started to see from Dingle, and that was kind of really intriguing and quite good to hear. And just to try and kind of give us a little bit of point of difference. It wasn't, the same product that people are picking up, or a generic Irish whiskey, or even, maybe worse than that, just one of the new Irish whiskies in a disparaging way, which in fairness I don't think is really said, but that was, always a fear that we'll all come out and do the exact same thing. As you alluded to, there being, three original distilleries, and then, likes ourselves and a couple others came along at a similar time, and then, there's 48, 49 or something now. So, there was always a fear that, are we going to come out with something similar to a lot of these other guys who are doing great stuff, but, we don't want to just be one of the pack. We want to differentiate ourselves, and in fairness, that's one of the most pleasing aspects of that kind of signature style that you're referring to.
I will say it's remarkably rich, fruity. You definitely know that there's sherry. I don't know if you necessarily know PX right off the bat, but it's a richer sherry, so definitely Oloroso or PX. But for me, there's a very clear note that I always get from an Irish whiskey made in the Irish style that just comes through. It's a sweetness, a creaminess, slight custardy, a more muted, sweeter lemon than I would get from, let's say, a New Make Scotch or a younger Scotch, or malt whiskey, I should say. That's really the better way to put it, a malt whiskey. And I'm definitely getting that here. It's not hot at all. It's 46.3%. It's not going to burn your mouth off at that ABV anyway, but
No.
it's not. It's only 6% or a little over 6% higher than Jameson would be, for example. And this is a world away in terms of mouthfeel and flavor that are getting behind it. And that's not to disparage Jameson. It's more to promote that Dingle has all of this additional flavor, and it's meant to. This comes across as a sipping whiskey rather than a shooting whiskey.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I suppose we'd always kind of hoped and aimed for that. For us, I think it's definitely something that, like, for me anyway, it's certainly a sipping whiskey. It's kind of got layers, and elements of complexity without being overly complex either. I think that's something that we're quite keen on, it being something that people, again, not just from a price point of view, but from a mouthfeel and a taste profile point of view, that is quite approachable. And it's kind of can maybe have a broader audience than, for example, probably our Bealtaine, which we'll try in a little bit, which definitely is kind of a little bit more complex, and has its lovers and otherwise. So, we felt that this whiskey was something that got across our style. Is a good introduction to Dingle whiskey, as kind of, the way, as we're starting tonight, and a lot of our tastings, certainly for newer markets, where we'll start off that we'll introduce them to the way our whiskey tastes like, and then we'll move into things that are, utilizing a little bit more complexity.
And uh, before I have another question about this single malt before we move on to the other products, but I do want to ask one last line about the beginnings of it. And again, this is another one that I know is before you joined, but just hoping, if you don't know, that's totally fine. Um, I am just curious to ask that, what was the level of awareness that Dingle was going to be or could be the first craft distillery in Ireland?
Um, there would have been an awareness. I think, I suppose, again, when you look back on something like that, it sounds obvious. But I suppose at the time it was more, there was a view that there was an opportunity. as opposed to being anything among the first. It was viewed as an opportunity that, how can there only be these three distilleries? This is kind of ridiculous. And, in much the same way that I suppose Oliver and Liam and Peter, who's the partner and the head brewer, would have tried to break the mold and were one of the originators on the craft brewing side of things within Ireland. And a lot of that was slightly different because a lot of it was carried from I suppose from the UK and from a lot of English kind of style beers. But it is I suppose the premise was still the same, that they kind of looked at it and went, okay, well, this can be done. After us, there was, at a very similar time to us, Carlo Brewing O'Hara's. There was the likes of Galway Hooker. On the beer side, there was Galway Hooker. There was, the originators of that kind of brewing scene, Metal Man. And then, more modern breweries started to crop up. So suddenly, by the end of 2010, 11, when the distillery started being thought about, craft beer had gone from us to like 10 to 15 breweries. And the thought process was kind of the similar one of, well, if the same thing can happen in beer, why can't it happen in spirits? And beer certainly in Ireland is a lot more locked up industry than the spirits industry is. So, I think it was probably a feeling like every great idea. It sounds obvious when you look back at it, but it was the thought process of why is nobody else doing this, as opposed to not necessarily needing to be the first. It was more to be amongst that initial group, like we were with O'Hara's and the Porterhouse when we started the brewery, to be in that initial grouping of distilleries that can break the mold of what's happening.
And to close that out, on the flip side of this, I mentioned people like Morris and James. Everyone with whom I've spoken has mentioned Dingle and pointed to you as a really a proof of concept. As you're saying just now, that nobody necessarily thought that it was possible that you could have small craft distilleries in Ireland anymore, and then suddenly Dingle's there. You've got a proof of concept. You're surviving, thriving, producing whiskey, and now, you know, 12, 13 years later, as you said, you're closing on another 50 distilleries in Ireland as opposed to you being the fourth. And I'm curious, looking back now, what does that mean for you and for the team?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's great, to be honest, to when we chat to the people, and we do get similar kind of feedback that, look, we were amongst, that kind of initial grouping that kind of, as you say, was the proof of concept. I think other aspects to it are, although we had I suppose, our pub side of the business and the brewery, we were still a small family run independent business that went off and did this. We didn't have the backing of any anybody. I was going to say any particular big company. We didn't have the backing of any company. Um, and we did it through I suppose, for want of a better term, crowdfunding exercise through selling casks. So it was as real for anybody else following on from us. It wasn't like we turned around and said, sure, look, all you need is, you know, 10 million quid from major company X, and sure, it's easy. I think people would look at Dingle and say, well, you know, they didn't do it the easy way, and she's, don't get me wrong, if you come to the distillery, there's lots of areas, where it was like, Jesus, we're still in a tin shed, put it that way. We didn't build a big visitor center. We didn't cut corners on anything that makes any product, but we if you asked the guys working there, we probably could have spent a bit more on air conditioning and the likes. So we did it in a certain way that meant we could survive and that we could get to a certain place. And we're still very much like that. We're still independent. We're still, the same group of shareholders. There's still been no kind of investment from anybody big or small. So yeah, I think it's for a lot of other people. I think they would look at Dingle and go, right, well, to an element of, well, if they can do it, why can't I do it as well?
Never a bad thing. And so back on the single malt, before going to one of the next releases, I wanted to point out that, pardon me, I just finished the sip of the single malt, and there's so much like chocolate, raisins, fruitiness. It's incredibly mouthwatering, which I like. I like a whiskey that makes me want to drink more. Um,
Well, so do we.
yeah. So, being a Gaeltacht region with rich and Irish history, the Celtic mythology and Celtic culture is nothing if not rich with symbolism. And so, on the front of the single malt bottle, as well as on the corks of all of your bottles, you have the figure of what looks like a man on there with, I believe, what is that, arrows and maybe a shepherd's crook.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose a lot of people might refer to a straw man.
Yeah.
What he is what called a Wren Boy.
Mm.
That what that is, it's kind of you're entirely correct, kind of going into that kind of Celtic mythology aspect. The Wren Boy and the Wren Boy features on what we call the Ran. The Ran is the 26th of December and is this was a what's frequently described to me as the most enjoyable day in the town. Um, anyway, and it's certainly the most unusual day that I think you probably come across in a in a Western democratic country. To be perfectly honest, it's I suppose that the kind of it harks back really to I suppose this, to be honest with you, when we've been looking at this a huge amount over the last year or 2 years and kind of delving into the history and it's one of those like any ancient story, there's a million different reasons for it, and each of them contradict everything else. So it's we've spoken to numerous lecturers, various people involved, and the kind of general consensus is the Ramboy has many different origins. It dates back to kind of previous to that, the mummers, which I suppose were there in pagan times, and that's where a lot of the costume aspect is taken. So effectively, for anybody, I suppose if you look up Ransday, WRENSDAY, you'll kind of start to see and Dingle as well. It'll probably come up anyway as Dingle because it is an area. It's a bit that's true. It's celebrated across the country in small pockets, but it's probably most well known to be celebrated in Dingle. And effectively, what it's done now is in Dingle specifically, there's four Rans, which four tribes, and on the 26th of December, each Ran will walk throughout the town, and they go from place to place, pub to pub a lot of the time, and collecting money for charity. And then they'll finish up in one of the pubs at the end of the day, and there's a big celebration. So that's kind of what the modern aspect of what the Ran has become. But effectively, it dates back to, I suppose, the crack and culture within the town of the day and people having fun and people celebrating that period of the year. I say that there's about 10 different stories about warding off certain types of birds, and there's warding off the British Army, and there's a number of different versions of the story, but effectively it kind of comes down to it's really just a symbol of Dingle and the culture and the way the town operates and the atmosphere and the feeling within the town. And that's something that we've, I suppose, taken to our hearts, as you say, it's on the front of the Dingle Single Malt on our, on our corks, on our logo as well. And it's just it's the symbolism really of what that stands for, dating back kind of thousands of years.
It's a, it's a beautiful symbol. I agree with you. At first, I thought uh, straw man was probably the easiest way to describe it, but no. When you look at it more, it's well, the person could be made of straw. Then I think about it, but other than that, um, I don't know. I like all these little symbols where each part has a purpose. You know what I mean? So uh, with that, I want to open up the next bottle, and but also tie in something you said about getting a little help from, or not really getting a lot of help from outside when you were starting up. So
Yeah.
as we go into that, of the other three releases, which one should we go to next?
Samhain would be
Seven.
the I suppose the chronologically the first one to go to.
All right. So Samhain, for those listening, you'll probably recognize the spelling more than you will the sounding. You'll It's spelled Samhain, which you probably know as the original Halloween, but is pronounced Samhain. So this one has it is rested in bourbon cask with a muscatel cask finish. It's also a single malt. We'll get to why I said also in a little bit. So it is a single malt finished for 18 months in that muscatel cask, and it's at 50.5% ABV. Nice cork pot there. These are serious
Yeah.
corks too. They're nice and wide, so they're not going to break off so easily.
No, they're good cork. Fairness, yeah, it's a
Yeah,
wide neck, so it kind of needs it.
yeah. So as I give that a second to get some air, um, you said on Barrel to Bottle last year, so I think this was the Binny's podcast maybe, that when you were first starting out, or when the distillery was first starting out, that uh, Midleton did help to train some of the guys who were working at the distillery. But for the most part, you're really bootstrapping it. It was really figuring things out.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. I suppose, yeah, like I suppose there's quite a collegiate kind of attitude, certainly that existed within Irish whiskey and still does. With kind of newer guys, and even for ourselves who are a little bit more established, we still have lots of questions. So I suppose at the time, really there was very few people for us to turn to, and especially in our locality, Midleton was the obvious one, and probably the obvious one anyway. Now it's obviously a little bit different. We do get asked questions, and we help, and then we ask other people questions, and I'm always kind of impressed by that kind of collegiate element. Even to the same thing of, turning up to trade shows and Board Bia, for example, who are the kind of export body for look after exports, whether it's alcohol or dairy or meat or whatever kind of Irish produce that you can think that's getting exported. Their government body, and but they bring everybody together at trade shows, and we operate under the Irish banner, and it's been said to us by multiple other countries. You can all the big whiskey regions. They kind of say, I wish we did this." Why aren't Scotch coming together? Why isn't American whiskey coming together? Why aren't Canadians doing this? And I suppose for us anyway, and the reason I kind of tend to look at it is because we started from such a low base, certainly in terms of the numbers of distilleries. I think there's an element of everybody's looking to help each other out. There's such an opportunity for growth in Irish whiskey that very much I suppose the phrase of, rising tide floats all boats is kind of, or rising tide rises all boats. That's very much felt by I think everybody I've met within the industry here, and because they know that, we've not got to that stage where it's, I suppose, cannibalism really of or dog eat dog or whatever it might be. We're still we're still a long way away from that. I'm sure it will happen. It would be naive enough to think that we'll all be best friends forever. I think I think at some stage it might start to get a little bit tougher, but at the moment, the opportunity is huge for Irish whiskey, and there's a lot of support there. But I suppose to go back to your point on bootstrapping it, yeah, absolutely. We still do that, to be perfectly honest. We've had a number of people come in over the years to help us out. But certainly when we started, it was Peter, whose trade was a brewer. He trained in distillation, and Harriet Watt alongside brewing. But his trade since he'd left college really was on the brewing side of things. So that was obviously a point of difference. But Peter was bringing his expertise into it. Um, but yeah, it was quite funny. There's lots of things I'd look back on and kind of just laugh at how we managed to do certain things, and why we would go out and do certain things a specific way. But that kind of makes the journey a little bit more enjoyable as well. We've um we've definitely gotten an awful lot better. Graham, who you alluded to there, was previously the master distiller. Graham would have brought an awful lot of structure and an awful lot of professionalism to the distillation aspect of the business, which was needed and really appreciated, I suppose. But it was yeah, it was certainly something that we're quite happy that came along. But I also wouldn't give away the first few years as well.
In those first few years, actually, before I forget to that, one other kind of point that was made was that as much as we might malign is too strong a word, but malign the larger distilleries, they produce all the stuff that's just mass produced and a lot of volume. There are a lot of good things coming from them that are filtering down in many ways to craft distilleries like yourself and many around Ireland. So, for example, in one of the interviews said Redbreast in particular has done a lot in terms of redefining Irish whiskey for the world, really, let alone just in Ireland, by promoting not just the triple distillation as an Irish thing, but the single pot still as a style. And we'll get to a single pot still in a little bit. I'm curious, do you still work in any official capacity with anyone from like Midleton or Bushmills or any of the bigger guys, or it's at this point it's strictly kind of consultation as needed?
Yeah, no, we've never worked in any official capacity. I don't even think we've paid anybody ever to come help us out. I'm sure we paid them in a couple of bottles that have left the distillery or maybe the drinks that evening. But we've never, and that was always what kind of, I remember there was one time where I think Middleton had come down to Dingle I think to appear at the Dingle Whiskey chapter of the Irish Whiskey Association. And I think that day, Jerry Buckley, who's the Cooper, would have come down and, came down and gave the guys working with us instructions and kind of a bit of a crash course, I suppose, for want of a better word, on things to look out for and how to kind of solve little small problems. There was, there was no, there was no remuneration, there was no nothing there. It was purely just out of whether it was out of his being decent or whether it was kind of out of the wider Irish distillers and probably both. But there's also an element, from Irish distillers' point of view that, they need and they want other Irish distilleries to be doing things the right way. Other Irish distilleries doing things, behaving like cowboys, isn't in any way beneficial and is quite detrimental to them, to us, to everybody else. So yeah, I mean, there's the kind of, the big brotherly aspect of helping the small guy out, but there's also probably an element of, right, we don't want these guys going out and creating a bad name for our category either. So and I look, I think that's always really important. And it's, look, we have no influence in comparison to those guys, but I think everybody in our industry, we're all quite protective of making sure that we are doing things the right way.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And with that, I'll take a first sip of the Samhain. I also want to jump back to the first distiller and your consulting distillers. This would be Michael Walsh and John McDougall. As I take this first sip of the Samhain, sorry, the that M, I keep wanting to say it. So going back to the
You don't
start of
pronounce really any letters in Irish.
that's
Just,
that's
you
kind of
know,
yeah.
MHBH, like you just don't pronounce them, but just
Like
it's a strange it's a
in
struggle I still feel.
in Irish, it's like the first and the last letter are safe. Anything in the middle, nope. And then you
Pretty
go to
much.
it's kind of like French, where anything at the second half of the word, you never know if it's actually pronounced at all or how it's written. So um, when the distillery was starting, first distiller was Michael Walsh with John McDougall in as a consulting distiller, and I'm curious to just hear what that startup process was like from the distilling side of obviously building the equipment or building, not like literally building the equipment necessarily, but of putting in the equipment, choosing what to do, and then what has changed and stayed the same since John and Michael were at the distillery.
Yes, I suppose probably in terms of the equipment side of things, that would have been predated Michael. So what it would have been involved with is Peter in his role, alongside John, um, as well as the other guys involved. But those were really the two people with the knowledge. Um, would have explored different options of what they want to look at. They always wanted to go to four sites. For the stills, that was always kind of the gold standard, and still is. And for the guys, it was kind of the non-negotiable. I'm not really sure how many other options were available at the time either, but I know that for the guys, it was always really important to get it there. I think there may have been a bit of queue jumping. I think whether it was John or I think somebody had a good contact and managed to move us up the priority list, which is always good, and got us probably started about a year and a half early from my understanding anyway. Um, but I mean, realistically, the distillery was built with, I suppose, a capacity of about 170,000 OLA, and is still the exact same. The whiskey side of the business is the exact same. Um, we've upgraded the still we use for gin, or added a new one, I should say, as gin started to increase. But on the whiskey side, we started off with a wooden mash tun. That's the exact same as it's still there. We have five fermenters, all wooden fermenters. They're still there, and then our three stills. And yeah, they're everything is the same. We're getting good use out of it. We do have good plans to increase capacity, but that really be down to kind of the amount of fermenters we have. You can't really swing a cat at the moment in the distillery, so we don't have a huge amount of space to add another, I think, four, if not five fermenters is the plan, and that'll allow us to produce about 320,000 OLA. So that's, I suppose, that's where we're planning to get to. If you walked into the distillery on day one versus now, elements of the building have changed. Very little else has changed. It's still fundamentally the same process as we were from the moment we opened our doors.
And we were just mentioning quickly before coming back in that not only the founders, but also the second master distiller, Graham, who has just left Dingle as of this recording. I just finished up last month. You have a lot of folks coming from this brewery background and brew pub, both from the drinking and gastronomic purposes.
Yeah.
And I know Graham in particular was asked during one interview, what kind of malts do you use? Because you've got all this brewing experience around the distillery. You throw in crystal malts and chocolate and all this stuff, and he basically said, no, we're sticking to pretty standard malt. Like, this is what tastes the best. It's what gives good yield. So this is what we're going to use, with a couple of exceptions for experimentation and all of
Yeah.
that. So I think the one thing I wasn't sure of totally was what yeast you use.
It's distiller's yeast. It's nothing. Yeah. I'll be honest. It's an interesting one because it's not. It's something we've been asked before, and but for me, I suppose, yeah, the experience around a lot of the business is beer and is brewing. But I suppose from John, who would have been, I suppose, the instigator on a lot of what we did initially, and then Graham coming in, they're very much distillers at heart. And certainly my belief is, you let the experts be the experts, and I wasn't going to I suppose put handcuffs on Graham that we wanted to do this in a certain specific way that may have been more familiar to the other half of our business. That was never really a consideration, and even prior to me, that wasn't a consideration. It was very much, let's do things the right way as a distillery rather than being, I suppose, too nostalgic about beer that we have to, I suppose, design a brewer's distillery.
Fair enough. You mentioned you're now at about between 160, 180,000 OLA, which is a pretty good volume. All things considered, it's a pretty good volume of casks coming out. That's what about 3 to 4 casks a day ish, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, approximately. Yeah, we tend to get about 22 a week.
Yeah. So I mean, that's some serious output for I've seen the size of the building, so I know there's, as you said, there's not a room to swing a cat. So um, I do. You've in talking about that expansion that'll get you to about 320 or so. This I think was described as Dingle 2.0, and in mid to late 2022, at least, I think you'd gotten planning permission and such, but it was still kind of figuring out those last bits. What does that expansion plan look like today?
I suppose we got planning permission from a local council, but it was overridden by the national board.
Mm.
So effectively, what that meant is we're starting again. Um, and that original planning, really predated a lot of the issues that we've kind of seen in construction prices. It predated a lot of the interest rate hikes. I'm not sure that plan that we had is or would be feasible even if we had planning permission. Um, because it was, I think it was, to be perfectly honest with you, the mistake we made is it was too centered around visitors as opposed to the distillery.
Mhm.
Um, I suppose the new plans, which I'm hoping we'll be moving forward over the coming couple of weeks, really, and start to publish them, will be much more focused on making sure we get the distillery up to the level we want to get it to and allowing visitors to look at that. I suppose is probably the way we're approaching it, and kind of an inverse of how we maybe were approaching it, and maybe an element of, we're in a touristy area, we can have a huge visitor center here and it'd be great. And but I think we arguably lost a bit of sight of the importance of kind of the really what makes Dingle unique and interesting is the authenticity and is the realness of the distillery. For anybody who's ever visited the distillery, you are as up close and personal as you'll ever get in a, forget about a distillery, but any kind of production setting you'll ever get to, on a general visit. And it's phenomenal in that sense. And I think we possibly lost a little bit of sight of that with what we were planning, and we've kind of made a good decision, I think, to kind of basically pull all that back. Let's amend the building to, it is a small building, but we can make the space work an awful lot better. To allow us to increase that production, to allow us to improve some of our efficiencies that we miss out on a little bit, just due to the way the site works. Um, but also making sure that when people want to visit us and see what we do, that they're seeing the real Dingle Distillery. They're not seeing a video, or they're not seeing, what were you about to say? I'm trying to think, a hologram or something like that of
Yeah.
somebody coming up and explaining what they're doing. That's not what our distillery is about. Our distillery is very much being able to touch and feel everything that revenue will allow you to touch and feel, I suppose.
And I can see what you mean. Obviously, I don't have the plans in front of me, but I can see what you mean about perhaps losing sight because, as you said, the town is built around tourism. The area is built so heavily on tourism and then fishing and agriculture. I mean, it's a primary driver. So having an area where you can bring in visitors and have them see what you're doing in a different way. I mean, I'm not on the planning council, but I think from a consumer's perspective, I can appreciate that because I would want to be able to visit and see what's happening, experience it. Go to, let's say, a tasting room, or have a visit with you to say, hey, uh, I'm I'm running this place basically, and I want you to see this X, Y, and Z. But so planning itself, it sounds like it won't be necessarily too much delayed. It's more maybe like hopefully mid to late 2024. So the next few
No,
weeks, you said.
no, it'll be into 25, I would
Mhm.
reckon. Yeah, our planning, like for perspective, I think the last time we went for planning, it took 2.5 years to get a decision. Um, I don't envisage that being as long this time. Purely, um, there's been lots of changes, and it's really, very polite about what I say about the planning board because we'll be going back into. But yeah, I mean, look, if you Google it, you'll figure it out fairly quickly. So I don't think we'll have the same issues the next time around because the board itself, I think, has improved. But yeah, realistically, I would think, in a good case scenario, it would be towards the second half of next year, I would think, by the time we're ready to go. But again, anything that what we're planning now really is a very small modifications. The biggest modifications will be moving equipment. That there'll be elements of recladding buildings and improving I suppose, as I said earlier, the conditions for the people working on site and all that stuff to make sure that, at the moment the distillery is perfect in May. That's beautiful in May or September or October. If you're anytime in a slightly colder environment, the distillery is freezing. And if you're there in the summer on a sunny day, the distillery can be swelteringly hot. So it's stuff like that we want to improve. So yeah, it's for me, we'll be able to. The biggest thing is to be able to make that change to increase production, um, and to be able to do that sooner rather than later.
And in terms of the employment of the locals and continuing to be a driver of local economy, is that, I guess, does the expansion allow for, let's say, more job hires, more economic incentive as well?
Yeah, no, we'll do. I mean, I suppose the obvious one is we're going from. So at the moment we operate two 8-hour shifts in a day, 2 8-hour shifts the following day, and one 8-hour shift the day after that. So we operate 5 shifts in 3 days, I suppose, put it that way. And then we start all over again. This will allow us to operate 9 shifts in those 3 days.
Mm.
So immediately it's adding a few bodies to that, pretty immediately. And that's just purely from that production point of view. I think we by from a tourist point of view, we'll add a couple of bodies. It won't be nearly what we were looking at previously. And, on a related but unrelated note, we will be aiming to be selling more whiskey, more gin and vodka as well. So I would imagine that number would increase as well over the coming years.
Gotcha. So before I move on from the Samhain, I just want to touch on for a moment. It's another real delight. It's a little bit drier than I expected, not in a bad way at all. It's perhaps might have a little more age to it, just a little bit more oak maybe. But so we know it's rested in the bourbon cask and then has that 18-month or so muscatel finish. So muscatel being this dessert wine, it's quite lovely. I don't drink it very much. I don't drink much wine anymore, but it's a lovely after dinner thing, and it's not overly sweet. It's not quite as sweet as like I'd say an ice wine, for example, or a real Moscato d'Asti kind of wine, but or a PX sherry for that matter. But it's got a very nice balance to it. Orchard fruits for sure, and I'm sure I'll have more detailed notes when the episode comes out. But um, it made me think. So whereas we had the Wren Boy on the single malt, the core single malt, on the Samhain, you have what I believe is a fire symbol.
Yeah, so I suppose the sound is, I think you mentioned earlier, is a part of the Wheel of the Year series, Celtic Wheel of the Year series, and sound is the first of that series, and I suppose we touched on the leaning into, I suppose, paganism, Celtic mythology with the Wren Boy. This is us going into it absolutely full swing. So this is, the whole Wheel of the Year series is built around eight pagan festivals, four fire festivals, and four equinox solstices. So Samhain is the first of the four fire festivals, and we have three of them here that we're talking about. Um, the fire festivals, I suppose, signify, and it says the whole Celtic Wheel of the Year signifies effectively the harvest. And I suppose the way the calendar worked and rotated around the harvest in terms of Samhain, I suppose being the end of that harvest all the way through to, I suppose, through Bridge, which is very much the start of that kind of February spring kind of feel. Bealtaine, which we'll taste as well, which moves into, I suppose, moving into that summer aspect, and then Lunasa, which is the, I suppose, start of the harvest starting in August. So it's that kind of covers that, and then the second half of the series is our solstices, equinoxes, which I'll be honest with you are so much more difficult to pronounce than than the three you have in front of you. They've caused so much debate because in like any language, particularly the Irish language, seems to have different pronunciations, but wildly different pronunciations depending on what part of the country you're from. So the Munster, where Dingle and Kerry is located in the province of Munster, it has a slightly different dialect to what we'd see in Connacht or Ulster. And I suppose in Dublin, where I'm from, there is no dialect. So we just have to like a particular one that we can listen to a little bit easier. But yeah, so that's part of that. So there's nine in the series. So we have our four fire festivals, which were first, then we have our four equinoxes, solstices, and then we finish with Lawn Droling, which is the Rand's Day. So that's a little bit of artistic license that we're introducing that into the wider Celtic Wheel of the Year series, and we're finishing with that the 26th of December this year. But yeah, all of our you're right in saying it's a kind of fire flame, as you said earlier. It's kind of that Halloween. Start with actually when we launched this in Dingle. Previously, we had this amazing fire pit out the back of Dick Mac's pub, which some people may be familiar with, and that was great fun. But all of the four fire festivals are obviously built around fire, but Sound in particular was kind of quite focused on fire. But each of those, so we're quite in-house on what we do. So Mark, our designer, who works with us, he would have drawn each of those symbols, and kind of, again, it's, there's not a book to say this is what each symbol looks like. It was kind of created by us. Our I suppose a little bit like the Wren Boy on the bottle. It's our interpretation of that. It's not something that happened 50 years ago, and there's loads of textbooks with images and illustrations that we can pull out. This is very much our interpretation of that Celtic Wheel of the Year.
Gotcha. And then, so with the um, before I choose the next one, between the Breda and the um, man, I just can't pronounce it right.
Yeah,
Um,
Alpha.
Yautana, thank you. Um, which one? If it's all right, why don't we finish on the Bealtaine? So we'll do the Breda
Yeah,
next.
yeah. So Lola Bridge is St. Bridget's Day, and the other version of it, if anybody was particularly interested and went, oh, I thought that was called it's called Imbolc. Um, that's I suppose the Celtic version. This is the Irish language version of it, patron saint, and it's the it kind of I suppose patron saint of Women's Day in Law is Lola Bridge. So it's that's kind of how we've called it that as well. But yeah, I suppose so. Lord Breach is I suppose a rye finish again. So each of the bottles in this series, all nine are, I suppose, the two things they have in common are they're all finishes, and they all matured originally in bourbon barrels. But that's the only, I suppose, commonality to each of the releases. So
And this
this would
will,
have been, sorry.
I was gonna say, as we'll see with the Bealtaine
Yeah,
being a
yeah,
single pot
exactly.
still, there's some variation between whether it's a single malt versus a single pot still as well.
Yeah, and I suppose the single pot stills have a different ABV that they're carrying. So I suppose Laura Bridge was 4 years in bourbon and 2 years in rye casks, which from Sagamore Distillery. So that's the first time. In fairness, I think most of these are the first time we'd used or we'd released from these types of casks. So they're all a little bit new for us. Certainly the Muscatel rye and the Bealtaine release is also the first time we'd used that type of cask as well. So yeah, we were intrigued by this. Is very much Graham's pet project. He kind of brought a lot of these barrels in during his time with us, and it kind of decided to release a few interesting ones and try things that Dingle really hadn't done before.
This one is lovely. I am a big fan of Sagamore, so I'll claim to be fairly familiar with their profile just because I drink a lot of their drank a lot of their rye in the past. I'd say it does come through here. The rye is not it adds a little bit of pepper spice, black pepper, white pepper, but it's not as kind of punchy as it could be. And I'm actually kind of okay with that because it means that that initial spirit is not lost.
Yeah,
Like a rye cast can be super powerful, but no,
yeah.
this, yeah,
And I think we kind of one of our later releases we use some rye again, and I think we probably get a little bit more of that from that release. I think you're right. There's little bit more subtle maybe on in this one.
is there any difference too in terms of maturation, particularly around the finishing, where if you're using a rye cask to finish, you're probably using a standard 53 gallon American barrel, whereas if you're doing let's say Shiraz or Muscatel, these are not necessarily the same size barrels. So um,
No, we use butts for muscatel, and yeah, we would have used your kind of standard size rye cask really.
right, so the butts, I mean, you're looking at something about three times the size ish of,
Yeah, not far off. Yeah.
yeah,
So you
yeah,
guys, that
rough
is
approximations.
yeah. Try. Well, I've had my couple of whiskeys now. My maths here is going to struggle a little bit.
uh, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, the no, the rye finish, I like it. There's not a lot of brands doing a rye finish, and I think it's because it's just kind of, bourbon was used for so long. You use wine casks, and then rye is this last new thing from America recently that more people are making, so there are more casks available. It does. I don't know that I've tried another Irish whiskey specifically finished in rye.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's
And
something that
then,
definitely has caught the attention of people when we've spoken to them about it. It's particularly people from the States who are maybe a little bit more used to rye whiskey,
mhm,
and trying to just get a little bit of an understanding of, because obviously there's a probably an infatuation with sherry casks at the moment, and we do an awful lot with sherry, but I think it's good for the likes of ourselves to experiment with quite different flavor profiles, and can, I suppose, show people we're not maybe a one trick pony as well, in the way we go about and do things.
yeah, it's good to be able to be, your own distillery for sure, but also be able to say you know how to finish something. Just not everyone does, and some people do it
Yeah,
sometimes. Okay.
and it's even the word finish is kind of, again, this is probably one of the things that I was dragged along with. But I kind of made a commitment when Graham started to make sure that I listened to people who knew more than I did. So it was I suppose the one aspect that Graham kind of convinced me on was, the word finish, maybe brings connotations of, has the whiskey, see how long has the whiskey seen the inside of the new barrel. But each of these are, I think, at least 18 months, if not most of them are about 2 years. And I think at times there's up to 3 years. It's more of a double maturation really rather than a finish. So that was something that we were quite keen on. Really getting the actual character from both barrels and not necessarily, as I say, just seeing the inside of it for for a relatively short period of time in order just to put something on a label. That's never been our game. We want to give people that authentic experience of what they're trying is the real thing and not just. gaming it for the label's sake to be able to advertise it in a certain way.
Sure. And with the this is going to be an odd question, I think, and it's one that came to me late in the research, but I think is relevant given Ireland's religious history and the UK's religious history. Obviously, you're using a lot of Celtic mythology and rites, not rites. That's not the right word. Celtic mythology, symbolism, festivals, and such. Understandably, in the Dingle region and other Gaeltacht regions, these would be fairly popular, still maintained. But have you faced any kind of pushback or reticence on the part of people to try because of pagan themes?
No, no, I think no, I mean even no, maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe I don't know. But no, we've never had anybody kind of push back against us for that kind of reason anyway. Not somebody's any ever told me to my face or anyway.
No, I mean that's a good thing. It was just one of those questions that as I was formulating them, I was thinking, wow, there's a lot of what you call at one point, pagan raves and fire
Yeah.
festivals, equinoxes, and um, especially ones like Wednesday, which is day after Christmas, and so might be seen as taking away from it by some people. I don't know. It was totally hypothetical, but it was like, let me throw this out there and
Yeah, no, it's an
see if that
interesting
would happen.
question because it's yeah, no, I think for us it's I think people just kind of embrace the uniqueness of it. There's definitely there's a little bit of a like a pagan revival happening, where that kind of yeah, just people are looking at the kind of back to past and kind of interesting stories that appear and it's not really something that's really been explored, but you just see it kind of in Irish culture a little bit more frequently now. So, we're not the only people talking about this type of thing, as well, which can help.
Sure, and it helps too, like I was saying that, or alluding to, that you are doing it in a region so connected to its Irish roots. You're not a distillery in Kentucky pulling in some Irish
Yeah, and even if we were in Dublin, to be particularly honest with you, it wouldn't make
yeah,
sense. It just
sure.
like the reason it makes sense is the location that we're in and the fact that it is, like last weekend was failing Bealtaine, which is Bealtaine, the third whiskey we try. And you referenced the pagan rave. That is the pagan rave. Um, and it's something that actually as an event and as a festival certainly it seems to be more and more popular every single year. It was probably a little bit niche 10 years ago, but by all accounts, I didn't make it down this year. But last week was, the town was absolutely buzzing in a way that hadn't ever really been as busy as that for that particular festival. So yeah, it's definitely getting a new lease of life, I suppose. I'm sure there's some kind of aspects to that.
Oh, with that, I'll pour open the Bealtaine, which is a triple distilled Irish whiskey rested in bourbon casks with a Shiraz cask finish. Although, as you said, it could be described better as a double maturation. This one, though, as we alluded to, it's a single pot still as opposed to single malt, and is at 52.5% ABV as opposed to 50.5. So an extra 2% on the ABV there. I mean, right off the bat, with given it a red wine finish, it has much darker, beautiful garnet color to it. I'll give it a second to open up, but this goes back to, I think, a fundamental question of Irish distilling, which is that as a new craft distiller, as the first craft distiller, obviously you could have gone in either direction of single malt or single pot still. Either one would have been, historically acceptable, accurate, and would have just come down to kind of which style you want to go to. But you know, the founders and subsequent generations, if you will, of people at the distillery clearly decided, no, we want to do both of these. And I'd love to just hear a bit about that thought process of why do both.
Yeah, good question. I think because we didn't know any better, if I'm being particularly honest.
That's sometimes the best answer, honestly.
Yeah, like I mean, I really couldn't emphasize enough how much this was flying by the seat of our pants, really, in those first few years. So, yeah, I think it was an element of why not. Um, there was I suppose that is often debate, and I discuss it with colleagues in other distilleries. Some people have gone, single malt only. Some people, I'm not sure there's too many that are only doing single pot still. In fact, I'm not sure there's any. But there's a lot that would do single malt only and wouldn't produce pot still, and some people don't see the value in pot still, because it's a funny one because it is. I always tend to tell people it's the worst named product or category ever. The amount of people I talk to and they go, I was at a trade show last week and, people are saying, oh, single pot still. So, and I kind of say, oh, you've heard of single pot still whiskey before? And he goes, yeah, that's because it's distilled in a single pot still. And I'm going, well, no, okay. So you're already on the back foot kind of almost immediately in the way it's being described.
Mm.
But I find it really interesting, and we discussed this quite a lot. If you look at, the most famous single pot stills, Red Breast, Green Spot, they don't outwardly advertise themselves as single pot still whiskies. They're Irish whiskies, and they kind of the single pot still is not, front and center. And in stuff we've done previously, we had two series. We had a single malt series, we had a single pot still series. We were really kind of like pushing the fact that this was a single pot still. And then I look at everybody else and and then I kind of realize that most people don't really know what it is. But if I say, do you know what a single pot still is? No, I don't. Or it kind of becomes clear that they don't. I say, have you heard of Redbreast? Oh yeah, I love Redbreast. You're kind of going, okay, well, that's a single pot still whiskey. And I think that's the challenge of it for lots of people. So a lot of people don't go near it because a lot of people prefer the style. But I think, I'm always a fan of the saying, when you're explaining, you're losing. And I think people struggle with the idea of having to explain what single pot still is and try and sell it, whereas everybody knows what a single malt is, or everybody who's picking up their whiskey knows what a single malt is.
It's yeah, it's a term that I always compare it to like the number one rule in a dictionary is you can't define a word while using the word in a definition
Mm.
thing. And so it can be very confusing. It took me a while to learn it while I was and to understand it while I was first getting into Irish whiskey in any real way. And um
No,
it's
it's very
yeah,
badly named. If
yeah.
there was named, if it was named something a bit more strange or a bit more realistic to what it is, I'm sure we'd have a much easier time explaining it. But naming it after equipment that you use to also produce single malt is yeah, it's a bit baffling, but
Yeah. Well, just in because I want to be conscious of your time. So just in let's say the last 10 minutes. Is that all right with you?
yeah, no problem.
So just in the last 10 minutes or so that we've got, well, first off, I'm going to take a few sniffs of this and a sip. But I wanted to just go into looking forward for Dingle. So in one of the kind of earlier interviews, and I think this might have even been like 2018 or something, um, you said that the government was a huge help when you were starting up. As you said, a lot of it was bootstrapping. It was a couple little help from Midleton, but really a lot was just by the seat of your pants and getting it done and figuring it out along the way. I'm curious now, 12 years into production and now you've become this economic driver. Has the government started helping at all in terms of really any part of the business?
Yeah, look, yeah, I suppose I mentioned Borbia earlier, Borbia and export. I said the export side of things that we're doing quite a good bit of work with. And there's part of my she's 2018. Okay, 6 years ago, my naivety of you also have to ask the question as well. You also have to know what different bodies do, and you have to play the game a little bit better than we probably were previously playing it, or understanding what pitch the game is being played on. Is sometimes a bit of a struggle. So no, it's not. There's not. I remember actually Michael Walsh. I think he turned around to Oliver at one stage and said, I think he kind of was understanding the way excise duty. This is previous to him. He was just working in the distillery at the time. I think he was understanding how much excise duty was being paid. And he kind of just suggested that why isn't the government just funding distilleries because they're paying so much excise duty, they'd fund themselves, they'd pay back the grant in, a couple of years if they were successful. So it's like there's elements that I kind of do find baffling that, as a proof of concept, you know, we've proved our concept. There's very little funding that we could get, for example, for a new distillery outside of, the biggest one is what's called Uderos na Gaeltacht, which is this is a local body which do support us, and they're very proactive. They're pro jobs. Their KPI is job creation in the Gaeltacht region, and that's unashamedly what they're about. And promoting the Irish language within that because it's the Gaeltacht region. But yeah, so those two bodies have helped, but everybody else, no, not necessarily as much as we'd like. I should say because I'd be shot if I don't say this. In a shameless plug for Bealtaine, it did just win a double gold at the San Francisco Spirits Awards. So it's the first time I think we'd won a double gold at that. So that was always kind of a nice one to get, and a bit of reward for the guys producing the whiskey as well.
It is really a fantastic pour. The single pot still being a totally different profile than the single malt. It's much more. It's right what I expect it to be in terms of it hits me on the middle tongue. It's spicier, a little more piquant, more of that pepperiness, almost like a rye in certain ways. I find unmalted barley can mimic rye in some of the compounds and ways it comes
Yeah, yeah,
across.
I get that.
And then the Shiraz cask, of course, as I said, it gave the color. It's a beautiful hue in there. There's also dark red fruit, a little bit of tannin, which I didn't note in the previous three releases. Uh, I don't usually like tannin, but in this case, it's not tannic. There's enough there to give a little extra body, counter some of those uh, more peppery notes. Um, yeah, it's just really I'm really enjoying it, and I think the extra 2 percentage points in the ABV do make a little bit of a difference. And I'll just ask. I know. So the single pot stills all come out at 52.5, whereas the single malts come
Yeah.
out at 50.5. What does that extra 2% do or not do?
Yeah, I suppose in conversations with Graham and Paddy, who's since taken over from Graham, um, the guys both felt that I suppose the single pot still and that kind of spice that it kind of generates could handle that 52.5%, whereas in a way that it was felt that the single malt was performing better at a slightly lower. Now, look, I mean, yeah, there's a couple of percent in it, but I think the general feeling was that the single pot still could kind of stand up to that kind of higher ABV, and we were quite happy to that because for us it's kind of we want to showcase this whiskey in its finest, at a level that we're not putting everything out at cast strength. We have done a lot of cast strength stuff before, and we probably will again. Um, but it was a level that we went, right. We're also not putting this out at 40%, and it was kind of a nice level for us where, I think it challenges people. It kind of and it showcases that particular whiskey, the pot still series, in as good a possible light as it can be.
And with that, I'll put you to the last question that I have for you, which is, as you've grown over the last 12 years, as you've been producing quite a bit more, grown to 160, 180 OPA, and hopefully soon in the next year or two to be growing even more. What uh, what do the markets look like? Where are you targeting? I'd say where you've been targeting, and also where have you found has been easier or more difficult to enter?
Yeah, I suppose for us, the US is obviously a key market that we've done okay in. I think there's an awful lot more for us to do it. For me, it's about, I always kind of loathe the concept of, well, we are in this many markets, or even when you get to the US, it's, well, we are in this many states, because for me, it's about building sustainably within a particular market over, whiskey's a long-term game over that longer period of time, and not just, throwing it out there saying, well, we're now in 40 markets, or we're in, 35 states in the US. I just think it's a poor measure of it. Whereas for me, the US is something that we've started to get a little bit of traction. We've some people that are, big fans of ours. We're getting a little bit more interaction on what we're seeing on it. We're starting to move product a little bit more. And so that's been great. For us, probably our best market by per capita or, I suppose per ranking of where it sits on a league table is Germany. Germany is a terrific market for us on the whiskey side of things, and punches well above its weight. And there's just a real fascination for what we're doing. There's an intrigue, and I find that there's a willingness to kind of really want to learn about what we're doing at Dingle. Which, I don't know whether it's the German stereotype, or something like that they want to kind of really dig into the detail on it, and we're kind of happy to provide that detail. And so that's been a supermarket for us. But for us, the next 2-3 years is probably driving into the US market is kind of certainly my kind of key goals over the next 18, 24 months. Because I think we're doing okay. I know we can do an awful lot more than what we are doing.
Fantastic. I look forward to seeing more of Dingle on the shelves and in the glasses. So, Elliot Hughes, thank you so much for coming on, spending all this time with me today. It has, listeners, it has literally gone from light to dark in the background for Elliot
Yeah, yeah.
as we've been speaking. So he spent quite a bit of time with us today, speaking about Dingle Distillery, about the history of it, and about these products coming out. So, once again, just thank you for coming on, for your generosity in sharing these bottles to try and to talk about. Hang on with me for just a second after recording to close things out. This has been another episode of the Whiskering Podcast. Thank you to everyone who's listening. Remember to like, rate, subscribe. You can also submit questions. We're going to start taking questions if anyone's got topics, like, for example, what the hell is single pot still? If you need a little more explanation on that, happy to dive into that one day for a couple of minutes at the beginning of the episode. And yeah, thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all next week. Hey folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Whiskering Podcast. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and click that subscribe, follow, or like button. Leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and let me know what you want to hear. You can reach out to me through the podcast apps, or email me at david@whiskeymyweddingring.com with any suggestions or ideas for new show guests. You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/whiskeymyweddingring. That's whiskey with an E, for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you access to bonus content, including our soon-to-resume Under the Influencer series, and $25 a month means you join the Barrel Share Club. Each month, Barrel Share Club members get to try products sent to me for review, bottles from my own collection, and sometimes bottles that I just pick up because they're fun or interesting. Right now, only 5 spots remain in the Barrel Share Club, so grab your place today. Finally, please follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Whiskey My Wedding Ring or at Whiskering Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Whiskey Ring. You can follow on Facebook at Whiskey My Wedding Ring or join the Facebook group, the Whiskey Ringers Group. And I hope to see you there. Cheers, thank you for the support, and see you next time.